Welcome to our Mary Greeley Primetime Alive presentation, ISU Wellbeing and Exercise Laboratory, Current Work and COVID Data. I am Vicki Newell and I manage the Primetime Alive program. As a reminder, if you'd like more information about Primetime Alive or to sign up for programs, you can go to mgmc.org/PTA. Our presenter today is Dr. Jacob Meyer. Dr. Meyer is an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology and the director of the Wellbeing and Exercise Laboratory at Iowa State. He hails from Madison, Wisconsin, and his academic path began at St. Olaf College before he completed graduate school and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in kinesiology and the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health. Dr. Meyer then came to Iowa State University in 2017. His research focuses on the associations between mental health and physical activity, exercise, and sedentary behavior using both epidemiological and psychobiological approaches. His current work examines how exercise can be used in the treatment of depression and in the behavioral and psychological effects of the pandemic. Please welcome Dr. Meyer.
Super. Thank you, Vicki, for that introduction, and I look forward to talking with all of you here today. We'll go through some information about what I do research-wise in the lab and what we're sort of thinking about and looking at, and then part of the impetus for this particular talk was someone else hearing about the talk and thinking that the COVID-related data that we have might be particularly interesting or useful for the Primetime Alive group. So we'll think about, in particular, some of the COVID data that we have, and then also general information related to older adult health during this pandemic period. So my overall driving focus and the focus of the lab that I run at ISU is really trying to figure out how exercise and then mental health, and in particular depression, are related. So my own personal background, while I was at St. Olaf College, I went through a couple of periods of clinical depression. I had a roommate who at the time was also active. He and I both played on the soccer team at St. Olaf, and he suffered from bipolar disorder. And what I started to notice was that during periods of our sort of lives, as we were more active, whatever symptoms we'd been experiencing tended to go away. And in particular, right after practice, no matter how us or other people who went into that, at the end of practice, we were in the sort of best general state we'd been in all day. And that effect lasted for, hours, maybe through the rest of the day. And it got me to thinking, what's happening that is causing physical activity and exercise behavior to be influencing our mood in such a powerful way, both in terms of my own with the depression that I went through, and then my roommate's bipolar disorder, which would sometimes lead to really high highs that would get normalized by activity, and then also really low lows that would again get normalized by activity. And so it sort of kicked me off into my academic journey of trying to figure out what's happening when people exercise that leads to the changes in the way that they think and feel. And if we figure out what's happening, sort of like the psychobiology of it, what that underlying mechanism is, we can start to create treatments that maximally target those mechanisms related to how exercise influences mood, mental health, and cognition. Okay, so there's one side that says exercise and one side that says mental health, and there's an arrow that goes between them. And that's what we're thinking about. The other piece of the puzzle that I like to consider is that sort of psychobiology. So what's the pathophysiological relationship between exercise and mental health? So is it changes in neurotransmitters that get prompted by exercise that end up leading to changes in the way that people think and feel? Is it changes in different neurotrophins? Is it changes in endocannabinoids, a recent area of research that I've been involved in? And it's not totally clear what those underlying mechanisms are, but in that search for understanding those mechanisms, it'll help us lead to sort of better and improved ways to target mental health, both through exercise, but also through any other kinds of means. If we can figure out what's connecting exercise to mental health, then we would be able to figure out how we might be able to, pharmacologically manipulate that or influence in a different way. So that's really like sort of the overall picture of what I think about. Up next on the slide would be a couple of images that would pop up and sort of put together this three-part picture of exercise to mental health, working through some biomarkers or pathophysiology. And we've got a number of things going on in the lab that have tried to understand these different pieces. And I'll just briefly talk about a couple of those sort of in the context of like what it is I do, what my expertise is, and then we'll dive into the COVID-related data. So one of the projects that we have ongoing right now or just completed was looking at trying to change sedentary behavior. So the amount of time that we sit or lay down or but are awake. And how do we reduce or intervene to change our sitting patterns? And that project attempted to reduce sitting time in adults who had chronic low back pain, with the idea being that if we could reduce the amount of sitting that we're engaging in, people with low back pain, that might end up influencing their pain and leading to maybe more active behaviors. So if we, instead of thinking about like, let's go exercise, let's think about let's just sit less. And we might see an accidental knock-on effect on activity as a result of that. And so that project just wrapped up and we're in the analysis phase there. A couple other projects we have going on. Normally these would show up with, fancy cool animations, but we're working with what we got right now. The Track 9 project is a project where we're trying to understand how physical activity might be related to treatment success rates for people who enter inpatient substance and alcohol abuse treatment facilities. So that project is working with a company who does a lot of clinical tracking in inpatient substance and alcohol use disorder treatment facilities. And they try to use their algorithms and the stuff that they collect to determine who's going to succeed and who's going to try to leave early so that they can give that information to the clinicians. And we've had them include physical activity data to start to understand if physical activity could be an important predictor of how successful someone's treatment is going to be. With the idea being that if it is a predictor, then we might be able to incorporate exercise more systematically into residential inpatient treatment facilities in a way that would have positive outcomes on sort of the big picture of treatment success. So that's Track 9. The drink study is a funky industry-sponsored study trying to understand how different beverages relate to cognitive function during rehydration. So we have a couple of beverages like Gatorade where we have people dehydrate. So they go into a hot chamber that is humid and then they exercise for 20 minutes to an hour or longer until they've dehydrated to a certain precise amount. Then we test their cognitive function, then we rehydrate them, then we test their cognitive function again, and we see if the different beverages that they're using is somehow related to the rebound that we hope to see with their cognitive function. So that sort of gets more at the pathophysiology, looking at what are the clinical differences or the pieces of the components of the beverages that are related to cognitive function and how that changes over time. So there's a lot of different pieces of the work that we do, but the overall question is how does exercise relate to the way that people think and feel, and how can we use what we know about those relationships to improve people's lives? So the COVID data, which you see sort of at the top there, will be what we talk about primarily here. So as the COVID pandemic started to unfold 2 winters ago, crazy to think that is that long ago, but 2 winters ago, myself and a couple of other investigators started to realize that this was going to be an opportunity to look at sort of a natural experiment in people's lives, insofar as there's going to be a huge effect on behavior that was going to happen in response to the pandemic, in response to social distancing guidelines, to changes in patterns of who people can see, how often they can see them, changes in the workplace, et cetera. And this was going to really affect behavior. And as the people that we were all considering, okay, how does this affect physical activity behavior? Are people going to be less active? Are they going to sit more? Are they going to use screens more? And how are each of those things going to affect their mental health? And so we took a cross-sectional sample in April, sort of the first week of April in 2020. And then we had people fill out surveys every week for the subsequent 8 weeks, so over April and May of 2020, as we saw changes in sort of the restrictions that were in place. So I know April and May of not this year, but last year is a long time ago. But over that time period, we saw sort of the immediate implementation of public health guidelines and protocols related to reducing the spread of COVID. And then it started to ease over that time period. And we wanted to see, okay, as things are changing sort of in society, how is that affecting people's individual behavior? And how are those individual behavior changes important or not important for their mental health? So we'll look through a couple of pieces of that. So really, we got pushed in this direction due to a number of things, one of them being that it was quite clear that a number of major institutions were going to close down to in-person activity. So Iowa State, obviously, one of those. Mary Greeley also certainly affected. And gyms and other places where people engage in physical activity were affected as well. In most cases, that was one of the things that got shut down the earliest and then lasted the longest because of people's increased breathing rate, sweating, likelihood of exchanging, accidental bodily fluids or more droplets due to increased breathing rates and perspiration. So it was pretty clear that in-person exercise behavior was going to change. And so we were like, okay, how can we measure this and figure out how that's affecting people's health? So we designed a cross-sectional as well as prospective longitudinal survey to try to figure out what people's current behavior was, what their behavior was like before the pandemic, and then how that behavior was going to develop over time. So we sent an email blast to all of the employees, all of the faculty, staff, students at Iowa State. And then the ISU Foundation was also kind enough to allow us to send an email to every single one of the ISU alumni that they had email addresses on file for, which was over 100,000 people. And granted, we didn't end up with 100,000 people in our study, but it allowed us to target and reach a bunch of people who were not necessarily local, were spread across the country, and allowed us to really have a much greater reach than we otherwise would have. And so we asked people about, who they were, their demographics, their health history, and then we started asking people about changes they were making in response to the pandemic. So were you self-isolating when you filled this out? Were you quarantined? During that period, there were shelter-in-place or stay-at-home orders. Were you under or following one of those? Social distancing, et cetera. And then we also asked if people were doing different behaviors currently and how they had also done those behaviors in the past. So we asked people, are you a smoker? Currently, are you smoking more or less or the same than you were prior to the pandemic? We also asked people their physical activity levels. So before you made any changes in relation to the pandemic, how active were you? How active are you now? Same thing for how much sitting people are doing and how much screen time they were doing. And then we went through a series of sort of the standard field-wide measures of mental health. So we asked people about their stress, their loneliness, their positive mental health, their social networks, their depression, and their anxiety. And we wanted to figure out how are each of these mental health components related to changes in behavior that might have happened in response to the pandemic. So yes, I said we had over 100,000 people who we sent it to. We got 3,000 people to fill it out. And most of those 3,000, 3,200, most of those 3,200 continued to fill it out across those next 8 weeks, which was super helpful. In general, the sample that we had completed is pretty well represented across different age categories. You can see on the slide here what the different categories of age and sex, marital status, et cetera. this wasn't a perfectly representative sample of the U.S., in large part because of how we collected the data. So we had sent out this mass email to alumni of Iowa State. Not surprisingly, we had a well-educated sample compared to the United States population, in which the average person is not necessarily the holder of a degree from a four-year institution. So this was a well-educated sample, but aside from that, generally gave us a pretty good look at how behavior and health was related, behavior and mental health were related. So in particular, I think it's important to think about the age of the participants. As I'm talking to Prime Time Alive, that seems to be an important thing to consider. And what we see here is the number of study participants. This is a cool graphic that you can see the distribution of sex across age groups in the United States. And so what you see here is from 0 or newborns up to 100-year-old people, the number of people that we have who are females, and then the number of people who are males. And what you can see is that as we go up in age, we're sort of consistent between 0 and maybe 70 or 65 or so. And then we start to drop off in terms of the number of people who live in the United States who are above that age cutoff. And if you map that onto the sample of participants that we got, you can sort of see that we had roughly the same number of people in all the age categories up until we got up to the sort of 75 plus category, in which we had many fewer participants. But that makes sense because in the US, we have many fewer people. So this is a helpful way for us to sort of check to see, is the information we're getting relevant to the United States? So what did we see? Well, changes in behavior. We saw, just to orient you to what's going on this slide, on the left, or in A, we see the people who indicated that they were previously active. So these are the people who met the U.S. physical activity guidelines. I'd ask you guys what the U.S. physical activity guidelines are, but I can't see what you would say anyway. I'm going to assume that you all said the U.S. physical activity guidelines are 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity each week, plus 2 days a week of resistance training of at least a moderate to high intensity. We didn't have great data about the resistance training piece, so what we're looking at here is people who had said that they met that 150 minute a week guideline prior to the pandemic, so that's previously active, those are the yellow runners, and then people who were previously inactive or people who didn't meet that 150 minute a week guideline prior to the pandemic. We wanted to see in these two groups, how did behavior change in response to the pandemic? And what we saw was that physical activity, the darkest gray bars, decreased in those who were previously active by a large amount. So a 30% decrease in response to the public health guidelines that were instituted in relation to COVID. Now you can see that the people on the left with the little yellow runner person, those are the previously active people who, prior to the pandemic, had been meeting the 150 minute a week guideline. They could have been doing more, but they had to be at least meeting that guideline. And then the previously inactive folks were those who weren't meeting the 150 minute guideline before the pandemic. And what we see is that in those people who had been active, regardless of what current restrictions they were under, so if they were in self-isolation or if they were staying at home or they were just doing social distancing, we saw roughly a 30% decrease in their previous activity levels. Whereas in those people who were inactive, we didn't see much of a change at all, maybe a slight increase in their activity levels. Now, if you're not active at all to begin with, you can't really go lower than that. Although I think as Americans, we would probably figure it out if it was possible. But given that, we didn't expect to see too much happening in the previously inactive folks. It was the 30% decrease in those who had been active that was concerning. And if we keep on looking through this graph, we see large increases in sitting and in screen time. So sitting, sort of the medium or the middle bars, and then screen time, the bars on the right, in both groups. So we're seeing really big changes here. So sort of 16 to 38% increases in sitting and screen time. So in response to the pandemic, we sort of have shifted people who used to be active somewhat out of their activity and shifted everybody into sitting more and using screens more. says the guy using a screen to talk to you. But I think that makes sense to a lot of us because we're starting to see this sort of not just as a single isolated response to the pandemic, but it's changing our behavior in the long term. And that's one of those things that we're sort of interested in trying to figure out. So how are those changes in behavior related to people's mental health? So we sort of broke it into 4 different groups. There were some people who were previously active and then maintained being active, even in the midst of the pandemic. Those are the maintained high folks, the 2 runners. There are people who increased their physical activity, so hadn't been active and then became active after the pandemic. There are many fewer of them, but that would be a good position to be in. Then there were a pretty good number of people who had been active and then were less active after the pandemic, and then there were lots of people who maintained being inactive. What we looked at was how is being in each of these different groups associated with mental health. And what we saw was that consistently in those people who decreased their physical activity or who were in the group who increased their screen time, that was associated with worse depression, worse loneliness, worse stress, worse social networks, and worse positive mental health. So, not great. Overall, we're seeing that whatever it was that happened to people in response to the pandemic was related to the way that they felt afterwards. Not great. What can we do to sort of think through those changes a little bit more that might be able to help us come up with how we might be able to target those or improve those in the future? So one thing that we wanted to think about was, what about those people whose work situations changed? So for many people, they had been working in person, as was the standard prior to the pandemic, and then got shifted to working from home. And 2 things that people in sort of the business sphere were worried about is, one, is changes in workplace environments going to lead to changes in their behavior? So physical activity, sitting time, screen time that we know are associated with energy, productivity, health. And are these changes in workplace going to lead to changes in mental health? So we did 2 things. We were first looking at the mental health relationships. And what we saw was that in the 2,300 people in our sample who had been employed prior to the pandemic, they got put in 3 different categories. 1, there was no change in their workplace. They kept on working in person or however they had been working before. 2, some people were WFH or working from home when they had not been before. And then 3, there were people who had lost their employment in response to the pandemic. In particular, right at the beginning, there were lots of jobs that were lost due to changes in the pandemic environment. And it turned out that those people who lost their job compared to people whose jobs didn't change had worse mental health. So worse depression, worse anxiety, worse stress, worse positive mental health. This is what we would expect, although there aren't a lot of good data looking at people's changes in response to a given event. But this is sort of consistent with what we were expecting. The working from home data, however, you'll notice that those gray circles and the associated confidence intervals span that 0, basically saying that mental health was not different across any of our metrics for those people who were working from home compared to those people who had continued working in person. This is useful from an organizational perspective to think about, like, okay, is it appropriate for us to send people home? Is it mentally safe for them to do so? Are there some sort of stresses that would put on people? And granted, there likely are many situations in which working from home was not beneficial or resulted in changes in productivity or in other concerns. But overall, we were seeing that if people were switched to working from home or not working from home, we weren't seeing a big impact on mental health. That this can also be useful information as employers are starting to bring people back into the office. Is it something that we need to rush people back into the office because that will improve their mental health? From this data, it wouldn't necessarily suggest that would be an important factor to consider. The other thing that we wanted to look at was, how does this change physical activity behavior, sitting and screen time, as the primary things that me and my lab look at. And what we saw was that people who were working from home had higher sitting and screen time, but no real changes in their physical activity compared to people who were working in person. We also see that people who lost their jobs had increases in sitting and screen time, but those were essentially to the same degree as those people who started working from home, which is not what we expected. We would expect that job loss would lead to sort of the greatest changes. And here, those two groups weren't different from each other. So this sort of gives us the idea that sending people home and shifting to online meetings is going to increase people's screen time overall and maybe also increase their sitting time, which is a problem, although thankfully it didn't have a huge effect on physical activity. I had pregnancy information, but I pulled it out based in particular on the fact that I think the group who I'm talking to is likely not pregnant or considering pregnancy at this moment. But if you're interested in the pregnancy data, I've got some other stuff that talks about that too. So I think the coolest part of the stuff that I'm sort of the most interested in is thinking about, okay, so then we had people fill out this survey every week for 8 weeks. Some people did fill it out every week for 8 weeks. Other people filled it out on a number of different times, but not all of them. But we could use data from anybody who filled it out at least 2 times, which turned out to be almost 75% of the people who filled it out once, which was really helpful for us to be able to understand a few things. And so this is a complicated graph. I'll pull out the stuff that matters, or a series of graphs, I guess. What we had was we had 2,300 people who gave us at least 2 weeks of complete data. And what we wanted to figure out was across those next 8 weeks, what was going to happen to mental health, and was what was happening with people's physical activity behaviors related to their changes in mental health. And what we saw was that over time, we have the sitting time results in this first ADG, the screen time results in the next BEH, and then the moderate to vigorous physical activity results in the CFI. And they were split based upon people who were in roughly the 90th percentile, or sort of the close to the most of the activity or screen time or sitting time, and then those people were in the 10th percentile, so somewhere close to the least amount. And then we looked at those two trajectories in those two groups over those 8 weeks. And for most of these two lines on each graph, they're pretty similar. So it looks like physical activity and screen time aren't largely related to people's mental health. Here we have depression in the top row, anxiety in the middle row, and positive mental health in the bottom row. But we do see one that seems to be worth considering further. And here we saw a significant interaction between the amount that people were sitting and their depression, such that people who had high amounts of sitting, so this was 12 hours a day of sitting, ended up not having any sort of different depression at the beginning of the follow-up period. But if that sitting maintained, they were going to end up having sort of higher residual depressive symptoms than those people who had low amounts of sitting. So this gives us the idea that pandemic-associated sitting might be a behavioral risk factor for depression, but also for sort of lingering depressive symptoms, even in healthy people. And that the sitting time changes that happened in response to the pandemic, so that increase in sitting we saw for lots of people, in particular people who are working from home, or people whose social engagements sort of cut down and they ended up being at home and sitting more often, that sitting is sort of a potentially insidious concern because it's something that might lead to higher amounts of depression down the line, even if it wasn't immediately apparent right at the beginning. This is one of those sort of yellow flags where it's like, hey, we're seeing something here that we should consider. It's not a major problem yet, but over time, if this continues, if this gap continues and it continues to widen, that would give us some indication that we need to be thinking in particular about how we can reduce sitting in our current environment. We also see some other, I think, interesting or useful data. Here we broke out the changes over the 8 weeks of depression on top, anxiety in the middle, and positive mental health on the bottom again, but by age category on the left and by sex on the right. So on the right, we see by sex, we know that in general, females have higher depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and lower positive mental health. So these were sort of expected relationships. And we also see that across time, the females and the males have roughly the same response. But if we look over here on the left, we see the different age categories broken out. You might be particularly interested in the sort of brown or yellow or orange age categories in the 55 to 64, 65 to 74, and then 75 plus. And we'll notice that in those age categories, those folks had the best depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and positive mental health at baseline, and they maintained that we're the best category all the way until the end. which is interesting. And it sort of makes you think about why is it that this pandemic seemed to be hitting the mental health of different age groups in different ways. What you'll notice is that the youngest age category, the 18 to 24-year-olds, had the worst mental health in each of the categories. Then the next group was 25 to 34-year-olds. And we see that although the sort of youngest group caught up eventually over time, they were the most initially affected. And then it sort of goes down by age over time. So the effects of the pandemic were clearly not equal across the different age categories. And that tells us that things that we want to do to try to improve or manage or assist in the mental health of folks need to take into account who the people are and how their specific stressors in relation to the pandemic might be unique based upon their age category or their sex. In particular here, I think one of the things that sort of pops out is thinking about what makes people who are younger more responsive from a psychological perspective to something like the pandemic. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Oh yeah, shoot, I had a second slide that basically said what I just said. But it says it because it's a good thing to say. So here we see essentially that older adult piece as being the bottom or best depression, the bottom or best anxiety, and the top or best positive mental health, consistently all the way across that time frame. So what I want you guys to type into the chat, and I'm going to figure out how I can go see the chat, is what you think might be an explanation for why the older adult group had the least effect of the pandemic and the continued best mental health on average over time. What are some factors that you guys can think of that would be part of that? You can type them into the chat. So in the chat, meeting chat section, that would be a useful place to put in any thoughts you have on this. And then I can respond to them and we can kind of talk through them. Retired persons had time to exercise and walk lots. Yes, Elizabeth, that makes a lot of sense. So the changes in particular were felt most by those who had regular employment or regular requirements for things to do during the day. So if you were a student and all of a sudden you got shifted online, that was going to be a big impact. Maybe you couldn't even live in your apartment or at Iowa State anymore. Those are going to be big effects. If you were someone who was retired, on the other hand, you had to start working from home. Well, you didn't work in that situation. So maybe that would make life a lot less impacted by this. It also meant that a lot of the other activities that maybe you had to do from a social perspective, you didn't have anymore. But it did give you time to be by yourself or to do things like walk, which I think would help. Certainly help to manage that mental health. Anything else? Any other thoughts about why older adults would be the least affected? Yep, just type them in, everybody who has thoughts on it. Yeah, we could avoid gatherings, going out and risk of catching COVID. Yeah, so it was especially if you were someone who was retired, you didn't have to go see people. You didn't have the stresses of your workplace being required to be in person still and having to have that associated risk, which was certainly at the beginning sort of unknown as to how big of a deal that would be. So a couple of the things that I have pulled out both from the research that we did, but also from some of the literature is experience. So older adults have lived longer than younger adults. And part of that comes with having dealt with a bunch of junk in your life. And that means that there's sort of a resilience or experience that comes along with that. And so then when confronted with a new potential stressor, people who are more, who have seen stressors of that kind before tend to have a much smaller immediate reaction, a much smaller brain reaction, much smaller physiological reaction. Then there's also coping strategies. So you might have, someone who's an older adult might have gone through, a job layoff before, or gone through some major life stressor, maybe a divorce or something else that someone who's younger has never gone through. And so then something like this comes about, and it seems like a really big deal, but it might not seem like such a big deal if you can think through what are the strategies I've used to cope with major events like this before in the past. So like Elizabeth had said, maybe this is an opportunity to walk because you know that that's a coping strategy that you might have used in the past to be successful. And so then, yes, this pandemic is not awesome, but you're able to cope with it in a different way. Another thing that there's some psychological research to suggest is that older adults, sort of the experience that comes with age, includes being more aware of both yourself, but also how you're going to respond to things. And so maybe seeing that this is going to be a big change in your life, maybe you're not going to be able to go see people as you used to before. You might be able to see that coming and adapt so that that's not a major problem when it does arrive. So most of the things that we saw happen immediately in response to COVID. So we saw people who used to be active reducing their activity a ton. We saw that not being active anymore was associated with worse mental health. Screen time increases were also associated with worse mental health. There's certainly some screen time that's required, like right now. And as part of many people's jobs, there's sort of a required amount of screen time. However, there's lots of screen time that's discretionary. You can think of what discretionary screen time might be for you in particular, but things like television watching or leisure time use of social media or other, doing a crossword puzzle online instead of in person or, on pen and paper. There's lots of opportunities for us to think about the different parts of our screen time that are necessary for job functions, for life, and then lots of opportunities where there are things that we do that might not be required. And I think the pandemic sort of put into sharp relief the differences between that which must be done and that which can be chosen to be done, and the importance of thinking through what choices that we're making, because those choices are going to have potentially important effects on our mental health. So it looks like maintaining activity is really important, and figuring out how to reduce that non-required screen time is really important, especially for those folks who ended up being in a working from home environment. For older adults in particular, I think it's really important to think about the fact that this is just, the stuff that I talked about was how our changes in behavior related to mental health. Okay, so there are some behavioral changes that we've all made, but I think it's important to understand that the risk of COVID is particularly concerning in older adult populations. This is data from a couple days ago from the CDC that shows the risk of death from contracting COVID-19 by age, as well as the risk of cases or of getting it in hospitalization. And so compared to 18 to 29-year-olds, the rate of death from getting COVID is relatively low in that group. But as you go up in age, the risk of death from contracting COVID increases. And by the time you get to 75 years old, it's gone up 220 times above that risk of death in the 18 to 29-year-old category. And 85-plus-year-olds, 570 times. So I think while we think about what are the important pieces of helping people encourage healthy behaviors and trying to manage mental health and stress, it's also super important that we understand that this is not some negligible risk that's not present. That the reason why we're making all these behavior changes is an important thing for us to consider, particularly as age goes up. So physical distancing and social isolation might end up taking a pretty heavy toll on physical health functioning, particularly in older adults who are going to see that risk as being much more real and important than maybe other age categories. Further, it's really important to think about how do we understand some of those sort of more vulnerable older adults, maybe people who also have other risk factors, and that while physical and social distancing is continuing to be an important component of daily life, those strategies for mitigating risk are especially important for older adults, and continuing to sort of have rigorous and structured adherence to those is likely to end up leading to things like loneliness and poor mental health, maybe in those groups in ways that we don't see it in other groups. And so understanding big picture, what we can do to help with things like loneliness and mental health will be really important to apply to those groups for whom this is going to be potentially the most impactful. Even if we were able to see those sort of older adults are in the best category. Yes, on average, those who filled out our survey were, but there are many people who don't fit into that category. It's important to think about how we can help support those folks as we continue through this sort of pandemic era. I wish I didn't have to say it like that, but that's where we are these days. It's also important to sort of think through the fact that, like, what might cause social isolation to be not that big of a deal for one might be very different than for somebody else. So people who still have spouses or partners around or live in sort of communal environments have a whole lot more resilience to situations like this than people who live alone. And so thinking through and understanding different vulnerabilities that might be specific in older adult populations is going to be really important as different places try to institute policies and procedures to help maintain or improve mental health in those groups. All right, so all this to say, what should we do right now? The first couple pieces are thinking about policy-related implications that are getting some traction at the federal and in particular at international levels to try to make sure that we can encourage and maintain physical activity and modify screen time patterns to those that are necessities. Examples of this include changes in China in which they're attempting to reduce the amount of time that kids in particular can use screens for gaming purposes. A couple of opportunities in the European Union trying to make sort of national-based alterations to behavior that's going to encourage reductions in screen time and increases in activity. The important parts here are really trying to figure out how we can deal with the emotional effects of physical distancing, both in trying to help change behavior, the sitting time, physical activity parts, but also just thinking through support for those who are going to be the most vulnerable to those physical effects of physical distancing. Post-COVID, we sort of want to figure out from a sort of behavior change perspective, we had all these people who were active and now have stopped being active. Not everybody, but enough people who fit into that category. We know it's super hard to change people's behavior in the first place. So to get someone to start being active is very difficult. We're not good at that as a species. And so now we've just sort of artificially inflated the number of people who are not active. And the question is, will people return to being their pre-pandemic levels of activity? Or will things like our sitting time increases stick around? Have we sort of created a new normal? Some information from the habit literature suggests that we've been doing this long enough that many of the changes in behavior are going to stick. And it's going to be hard to make reactionary responses to bring people back to pre-pandemic levels of activity, let alone even do better than where we started. I wouldn't say that the health of the United States was necessarily getting a gold star in pre-pandemic life. So there's still lots of work to do there. All right, so that's what I have for you guys. Thank you for being flexible with our technology issues. This is my lab up in the top right picture. Without them, none of this research gets done. I have some funding that I have been very appreciative of. And then, of course, my family is important in everything that I do. So these are my 2 daughters and a third one expected on Thanksgiving. So that'll be a fun addition. Anyway, thanks for your time.
If there's any other questions.
Sure. If you guys have any questions, please plug them in the chat box. I'd be happy to answer anything that you might have.
So I will work on our closing up our program, and if some questions pop up, we can have Dr. Meyer come back over here and answer those for us. So thank you for your flexibility today, Dr. Meyer, and thank you everybody out there. We'd also like to remind everybody about our upcoming programs. Wednesday, October 13th at 2 p.m., we have a program, Healthy Living for Your Brain and Body, Tips from the Latest Research, and this will be the third in our Alzheimer's series, our third and our last one with that series. And then Harnessing Habit for Increasing Physical Activity is Thursday, October 21st, and that one is at 2 p.m. as well. And of course, as we know with how things are going, we had a little glimmer of hope in talking about bringing programs back on site, but I think we all know with our current environment that that is not going to happen right now, but we will definitely always be checking that out. And when we can get to returning to programs in person, we will happily do that. I don't see that we have a question. Somebody said no questions, but thank you. So we'll leave it at that. If somebody does have a question, please go ahead and email me, and I will get an answer from Dr. Meyer for you. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.